My name is Corin Andrews. I'm 28 years old. I woke up after 3 weeks in a coma to a hospital room so empty it felt haunting. There was no father, no siblings, no flowers, no cards, not even a half-eaten bag of snacks left on the visitor's chair. There wasn't a single sign that anyone had been there. Just the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, and a thick sheet of paper placed neatly on the bedside table. At the top of the page, embossed in faint lettering, were the words, Andrews Residence, Greenwich, Connecticut. My father's handwriting appeared just below, sharp, cold, without a trace of hesitation. I read every word once, then again, then a third time, as if my brain refused to grasp what it meant. Karen, we have decided to stop paying for your hospital bills. Your brothers agree that it's time for you to take care of yourself. Good luck, Dad. I stared at the letter for a long time. My throat felt raw and dry. My heart felt unbearably heavy, like someone was squeezing it tight. Then the tears came, unstoppable. I cried for more than an hour, not because of physical pain, but because of the overwhelming feeling of being completely abandoned. But my father made a fatal mistake. He forgot about the one thing my mother had left behind. And he had no idea that just a few days later, a man in a gray suit would walk into that hospital room carrying a truth powerful enough to shatter his entire life. I grew up in a luxurious house in Greenwich, Connecticut, where everything looked perfect from the outside: tall iron gates, a perfectly trimmed lawn, a pool in the backyard, and dinner parties glowing under crystal chandeliers. But inside, it was a house with no room for me. My mother, Margaret, was the only person who made it feel like a home. She was gentle and warm, always slipping little notes into my lunchbox and teaching me piano every Saturday morning. I was only 12 when she died. That day, I had a piano recital at school. My father promised to pick me up at 8:30 p.m., but he never came. I waited in the school lobby for 45 minutes, calling him over and over, getting nothing but voicemail. Finally, I called my mom. Without hesitation, she said, "Stay right there, sweetheart. I'm on my way." It was pouring rain. The roads were slick. A truck ran a red light after losing control. The crash happened just a few blocks from my school. My mother died that very night. He said only one sentence: "Your mother went out into that storm because of you." From that moment on, I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I became the guilty one, the cause, the reason. He repeated it in different ways over the years, sometimes directly, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with a look. He shaped the story carefully, until even I believed it. I was manipulated into carrying the blame for my mother's death in that car accident, and the weight of it changed me. I lived in quiet obedience. I apologized too quickly. I never argued. I shrank myself to fit into whatever space I was allowed to occupy. Shame followed me everywhere, whispering that I had already taken too much from the world. That single sentence became a sentence of its own, a verdict hanging over my head for 16 years. 2 years after my mother died, Diane appeared. She entered my life like a cold breeze, polite, composed, but distant from the very first meeting. Diane was always perfectly dressed, her hair sleek, her smile carefully placed. She called me "Sweetie," gave me cashmere scarves, and spoke in soft, measured tones. But within a year, every trace of my mother in that house disappeared. Photos were replaced. Her piano sheet music vanished. Even the scent of her perfume faded from the rooms. Little by little, I learned how to disappear too. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand attention. I didn't cry. I convinced myself that if I were good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe one day, I would be loved again. But you know what? Silence never makes anyone more valued. If you've ever felt forgotten in your own family, comment 1. You are not alone. I left that house the moment I turned 18. There was no goodbye party, no well wishes, not a single word of advice. Just an old suitcase, a few sets of clothes, and the overwhelming relief of finally being able to breathe. I chose to study nursing and worked night shifts at a mid-sized hospital in Stamford. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Long nights filled with the smell of disinfectant, the hum of ventilators, and hurried footsteps echoing down the hallways. The work was exhausting, but for the first time in my life, I felt useful. My family lived less than 30 minutes away, in a 5-bedroom mansion with iron gates, a heated pool, and 3 luxury cars in the garage. But to me, that place felt as distant as another planet. I still tried to go back during holidays. Every time, I reminded myself not to expect too much. I learned to smile when I was introduced as the help in the family. I learned to stay quiet when my father said, "Nursing is decent, considering your abilities." I learned to swallow my tears when they celebrated Preston's achievements. While I received nothing more than a polite nod, I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, they would finally see me. But there are places where the more you try, the more invisible you become. That night, I got off my shift close to midnight. A 12-hour ICU rotation had left my body aching and my eyes burning from exhaustion. I drove slowly through the Elm Street intersection, my mind completely blank, focused on just one thing: getting back to my small apartment. I never saw the truck run the red light. There was a violent crash, the sound of metal crushing, airbags exploding, and then darkness. My father was contacted as my emergency contact. He came exactly once. Grant later told me that my father stood at the doorway of the ICU, looked at me lying there, and said, "This is going to be expensive." Then he walked away. The first week, a few nurses stopped by to check on me. The second week, only Grant came. By the third week, no one came at all. And then I woke up to an empty room and a letter of abandonment. He didn't just send that letter to me. He sent it to relatives, business partners, close family friends. In it, he described me as irresponsible, dependent, always blaming my family. He wrote that they were heartbroken, but had no choice except to cut me off so I could learn to grow up. The final line made my blood run cold. Her mother would be very disappointed. No one asked me what had happened. No one verified the truth. They believed him because he was powerful, wealthy, and always knew how to tell a story in a way that benefited him. I sat alone in that hospital room, feeling like the entire world had turned its back on me. But in that exact moment, in the depth of absolute loneliness, I realized something. If they had already decided to paint me as the villain, then I had nothing left to lose. And that was when I started searching for the truth. During my darkest days in the hospital, while I was drowning in overwhelming medical bills, a man named Richard Calloway walked in and changed my life completely. He introduced himself as the trustee of a fund my mother, Margaret Ellis Andrews, had quietly established in 2008, 2 years before she passed away. Sitting beside my hospital bed, he opened an old leather briefcase and laid out documents that proved the extraordinary protection my mother had put in place for me long ago. I was stunned to learn that I was the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust. It contained an investment portfolio worth approximately $2.1 million, and even more importantly, full ownership of the mansion at 14 Edgewater Lane in Greenwich. The bitter truth hit me all at once. My father had been living in that house for 16 years, but he had never actually owned it. My mother had purchased it with her personal inheritance before their marriage, and secured it through a prenuptial agreement. While my father used my mother's house as collateral for his private business ventures and deliberately concealed the existence of the trust by allowing my stepmother Diane to intercept my mail, my mother had anticipated everything. She had made sure I would be protected. Holding the documents signed in my mother's handwriting, I cried not just in grief, but in painful relief. For 16 years, my father had claimed she left behind nothing but debt. In reality, she had left me a shield strong enough for me to finally stand on my own. The truth about my father's fraud was the final blow that shattered the image he had spent decades building: the self-made, untouchable businessman. Through documents provided by Richard Calloway, I discovered that my father, Harold Andrews, had used the mansion at 14 Edgewater Lane, a property that legally belonged to me, as collateral for a $4.5 million commercial development deal with First Capital Regional. He had gambled with something that was never his. When the truth was exposed at the event, the bank's representative immediately suspended the deal due to invalid collateral. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. While my father had left me in a coma so he could focus on his business venture, it was his own greed and his disregard for the law that ultimately destroyed his empire. I walked into the ballroom of the Hotel Del Mar just as Harold stood at the podium, proudly declaring that every asset he owned had been built with his own two hands. Dressed in an expensive, tailored suit, he basked in artificial glory, completely unaware that I was standing at the back of the room with Richard Calloway and Mr. Whitfield from the bank. I wasn't wearing a designer evening gown, just a simple blazer and my mother's silver earrings. But I carried something far more powerful than diamonds. I carried the truth. As I stepped forward, silence fell across the room of 200 guests. Harold tried to maintain his composure. With a tight smile, he suggested we step outside to talk privately. I refused. This would not be handled in whispers. Attorney Calloway spoke on my behalf. He presented the 2008 will, the documentation of the irrevocable trust, the legal proof that the Greenwich mansion belonged to me. And then came the final blow, 3 certified mail receipts, each bearing Diane's signature, proof that she had intercepted and concealed official correspondence addressed to me. In front of investors, partners, and social elites, the carefully polished facade began to crack. The most shocking moment came when Mr. Hargrove, the representative of First Capital Regional, slowly stood up from his table. His voice was calm, but every word cut through the room. He asked for clarification regarding the collateral used for the $4-5 million deal. When it became undeniable that Harold Andrews had pledged a property he did not legally own, my property, Mr. Hargrove announced the immediate suspension of the transaction. A wave of whispers spread across the ballroom of Hotel Del Mar. Glasses paused midair. Conversations froze. Diane turned on Harold instantly, distancing herself, criticizing him in a desperate attempt to protect her own image. And my father, the man who had controlled every narrative for 16 years, stood there, pale, speechless. For the first time, his lies shattered in public, scattering across the polished dance floor like broken glass. But reclaiming my property was not the most important thing I did that night. The most important thing was clearing my name. For 16 years, my father had weaponized my mother's death. He repeated the same cruel line over and over. Your mother drove out into that storm because of you. That lie shaped my identity. It buried me in guilt. It made me obedient, small, afraid to ever demand fairness or love. So that night, in front of everyone, I revealed something else. I held up the official police accident report from 16 years ago, a document I had only recently recovered. The truth was nothing like the story he had told. He had promised to pick me up at 8:30 p.m., but at that exact time, he was sitting at a private poker game, his phone deliberately turned off. My mother had called him 5 times before she finally gave up. Only then did she get in the car herself, driving through heavy rain to come get me. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Because this time, the truth did not whisper. It spoke. My mother's accident was not my fault. It was the result of his irresponsibility. When the truth was spoken aloud, I saw something in Harold Andrews's eyes I had never seen before: fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when a carefully crafted mask is torn away in front of everyone. In that moment, a weight I had carried for more than a decade finally lifted. The guilt, the endless apologies for something that was never mine to apologize for, the quiet shame that shaped my entire personality. It ended there. After that night, everything my father had built on deception began to collapse. The $4-5 million deal with First Capital Regional was officially canceled. Soon after, he faced formal investigations for mortgage fraud from the State Attorney General's office. Diane, who had always loved checks more than people filed for divorce the moment she realized the money was disappearing. As for the house on Edgewater Lane, I gave my father 30 days to leave. It had never truly been his. Though the mansion was worth $3.2 million, I chose to sell it. I had no desire to live among the ghosts of cold dinners, silent hallways, and years of being made to feel unwanted. I started over in a sunlit apartment in West Hartford. I returned to nursing at a different hospital, a place where I was respected for my skills, not my last name. Preston tried to reach out with hollow explanations, but I chose clarity over chaos. I ignored him. Now, my peace looks simple. Thursday night dinners with Grant, honest conversations, therapy sessions where healing feels real instead of forced. When I look at my mother's photo on the bookshelf, I no longer feel the crushing weight of blame. She left me more than money. She left me protection. She left me truth. And for the first time in my life, I no longer apologize for existing. I finally get to live. I began rebuilding my life from zero, but with a completely different mindset. I was no longer chasing validation, no longer desperate to prove anything to anyone. Instead, I focused on healing, caring for myself, and nurturing relationships that were genuine and mutual. Each day, I became more patient with myself. I allowed myself to move slowly, to make mistakes, to learn without shame. The old wounds didn't disappear entirely, but they no longer controlled me. I chose to see them as reminders to live with more kindness, more strength, and more compassion. I finally understood that only when I truly love and respect myself can I offer real value to others. Above all, I feel grateful for the chance to begin again. Because simply being alive, being able to dream, to choose my own path, to decide who I want to become, that is an immeasurable gift. As everything gradually settled, I realized the most valuable thing I gained was not financial compensation or reclaimed property. It was the right to live a life that is truly mine. After lying motionless in a coma for weeks, every breath I take now feels intentional. Every step I walk feels miraculous. I've learned to cherish the smallest moments, the quiet mornings, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, things I once took for granted. Because when you almost lose everything, you finally understand what it means to truly live. Looking back on everything I've been through, I understand now that every turning point carries its own meaning, even if we only recognize it much later. The losses, the wounds, and even the moments that felt utterly hopeless all shaped the person I am today. Stronger, more aware, and far more grateful. I no longer blame the past, and I no longer resent the people who hurt me. Without them, I would never have learned how to rise after falling, how to endure, or how to truly value the peace I have now. Every lesson left its mark, teaching me to slow down and think more deeply before making decisions. I choose to move forward with a lighter heart, holding on to the belief that there are still beautiful things waiting ahead. The road may not always be smooth, but I trust myself now. I have already survived my darkest days, and I am still standing. If I could leave one final message, it would be this: never give up on yourself. After the storm, the sky clears, and each of us deserves a future filled with hope, love, and peace. In the end, what matters most is not how cruel the past was, but how I choose to live in the present and move toward the future. The pain that once broke me has become the foundation that steadies me, making me stronger, wiser, and more intentional in every thought and action.